Welcome back to another episode dealing with King David. This week we're going to be talking about King David and his wars with Saul, the Amalekites, and Ishbosheth. As of like last week, I'm going to do an overview, try to do a run through of this to make it a little bit simpler to follow. Instead of doing 5 hours of this, I do less of it. So we'll start with King Saul, and I'm not doing the history of King Saul this evening, but as you well know, King Saul was before he preceded King David. So, as always, I use the King James Bible as my reference, along with some other sources that make up about 1% of my research. I just go with the King James Bible. But in the King James Bible, the story of King David and his wars with King Saul span several chapters, primarily in the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And so the following I have here would be an overview of the key events and themes that are related to David and Saul's conflict. Number one, we find the rise of David in 1 Samuel verses 16 and 17. In verse 16, we see David's rise begins when the prophet Samuel anoints him as the future king of Israel, following God's rejection of Saul. At this time, Saul is still the reigning king, but God has rejected him due to his disobedience. In 1 Samuel 17, David at that point is a young shepherd who becomes famous for his defeat of Goliath, the giant Philistine warrior. The event marks the beginning of David's prominence in Israel. King Saul initially, he actually admires David, but in due time, the admiration soon turns to jealousy. The second part of this is David's relationship with Saul, and that would be in 1 Samuel verses 18 and 19. In verse 18, after he defeated Goliath, that's David, of course, David becomes a popular figure in Israel. Women sing songs praising David more than Saul. It's funny how if someone seems to like someone different or else, a jealousy sits in, as with Saul. Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000, which fuels Saul's jealousy. King Saul begins to view David as a threat to his throne and seeks to kill him. We find people like that today. It's an age-old story, but it's been going on forever. Jealousy just destroys people, and pride, and his pride came to his destruction, clearly. In 1 Samuel 19, Saul attempts multiple times to kill David, including throwing a spear at him during a feast. David escapes and becomes a fugitive, evading as much as possible Saul's attempts on his life. In 1 Samuel 20 through 26, we start with verse 20. David flees to Jonathan, who would be Saul's son, and of course David's very close, if not best friend. Jonathan warns David that Saul plans to kill him. The two make a covenant of friendship, and Jonathan helps David escape. We find in 1 Samuel 21 and 22, David seeks refuge with Ahimelech, the priest at Nob, and later in the wilderness. But Saul's paranoia, as paranoia often does, it grows as he orders the slaughter of the priest at Nob, suspecting they are aiding David. In 1 Samuel 23 and 24, we see David has several opportunities to kill Saul, but refrains from doing so. In one particularly notable incident, David spares Saul's life when Saul enters a cave where David and his men are hiding. David cuts off a corner of Saul's robe to show that he could have killed him, but he chose not to. In verse 25 of 1 Samuel, we see David's conflict with Saul is interrupted by a confrontation with Nabal, a wealthy but rather foolish man. And David's men are insulted by Nabal, but Abigail, Nabal's wife, intervenes and saves her household. Even then, women were taking care of their house. After Nabal's death, Abigail becomes David's wife. In 1 Samuel, 1 Samuel verse 26, David once again has an opportunity to kill Saul when he and his men find Saul and his army fast asleep. David takes Saul's spear and water jug to show that he could have taken Saul's life, but chose not to. Saul acknowledges David's righteousness, but the animosity continues. In 1 Samuel 27 through 31, 27 and 28, David, feeling increasingly unsafe in Israel, flees to the Philistines and resides in the city of Ziklag. Meanwhile, Saul's mental state is quickly deteriorating. He consults a medium, the Witch of Endor. Here we go. He's already dealing with witchcraft and sorcery at this point because he feels God no longer answers him through prophets or dreams. The spirit of Samuel appears and prophesies Saul's defeat and death. Can't read my own handwriting sometimes. 1 Samuel 29 and 31, Saul and the Israelites faced the Philistines in battle at Mount Gilboa. Despite David's previous experience with the Philistines, he does not participate in this battle. Saul is mortally wounded in this battle, and his sons, including Jonathan, are killed. Saul falls on his own sword to avoid capture. Saul's death marks the end of his reign and the beginning of David's ascension to the throne of Israel. And that's when we come to 2 Samuel 1 through 5, where David becomes king. In 2 Samuel 1, David learns of Saul's death and mourns for both Saul and Jonathan. He composes a lament known as the Song of the Bow, expressing his grief for Saul's fall and his close bond with Jonathan. In the second verse, David is anointed king over the tribe of Judah at Hebron, while Saul's son Ishbosheth is made king of the remaining tribes of Israel. And this, of course, sets the stage for a rather interesting civil war between David's supporters and Saul's house. In 2 Samuel verses 3 and 4, the conflict continues between the forces of David and Saul's remaining supporters, led by Abner, which would be Saul's general. After Abner defects to David's side, he is killed by Joab. David's commander, eventually Ishbosheth, is assassinated, leaving David as the uncontested king of Israel. In verse 5, David is anointed king of all Israel. His reign begins with a victory over the Jebusites and the capture of Jerusalem, which becomes the political and spiritual center of the kingdom. What we see here are the key themes in David's conflict with Saul. Despite Saul's hostility, and we have to remember this in our own lives today, but despite Saul's hostility, David continually trusts in God's timing, refraining from taking Saul's life when given the chance. David's faith contrasts with Saul's disobedience and impatience. Saul's jealousy of David's success and popularity ultimately leads to his downfall. His paranoia drives him to irrational actions, while David, though persecuted, shows restraint and humility. Throughout this narrative, this verse, the chapter, David repeatedly demonstrates mercy. sparing Saul's life on multiple occasions, even though Saul seeks his destruction. David's rise to kingship serves as a contrast to Saul's failure. David is portrayed as a man after God's own heart, while Saul's reign is marked by disobedience and spiritual decline. David's wars with Saul are part of a much larger situation, or I was going to say issue, in which God's plan for Israel unfolds. Saul's death and David's eventual unification of the tribes of Israel paved the way for his reign, which will be marked by further challenges, of course, but also great successes, including his desire to build a temple for God. Now we move to the conquests of the Amalekites by King David. This is another important event in his rise to power that is detailed in 1 Samuel verse 30. Chapter 30. This chapter is part of a larger narrative that demonstrates David's leadership, his reliance on God, and the unfolding of divine justice. This section will be focusing on David's victory over the Amalekites. With a tiny bit of background, before the actual battle with the Amalekites, there is a critical part here. David at this point was living as a fugitive and was taking refuge among the Philistines in the city of Ziklag that was located in the territory of the Philistines. Under King Achish of Gath, David had been accepted by the Philistines after fleeing from Saul, and he and his men had been serving as mercenaries. However, in 1 Samuel 29, the Philistine leaders, upon learning that David would potentially join them in their battle against Israel, reject David's participation. Despite David's earlier reputation as a mighty warrior, the Philistine commanders did not trust him, fearing that God would use David, who would turn on them during the battle and return to Saul. Therefore, Achish, the Philistine king, sends David back to Ziklag, where the story of the Amalekites begins to unfold. David's loss at Ziklag in 1 Samuel chapter 30, and it came to verses 1 and 2. And it came to pass, when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag, and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away and went on their way. David and his men returned from the Philistine territory to find their city of Ziklag has been raided by the Amalekites. The Amalekites, a long-time enemy of Israel, had invaded the region while David and his men were away. They burned Ziklag and took the wives of children of David and his men as captives. The sudden blow serves as a severe test for David and his followers. Not only is their home destroyed, but their families are taken as prisoners, which creates intense grief and despair among David's men. In verses 3 and 4 it reads, So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captives. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept, until they had no more power to weep. Man, these verses, could they even more capture the utter devastation of David's men? They weep for their families, feeling the incredible depth of loss. The emotional toll on David's men is profound. But it's important to note that David, as their leader, will have to guide them through this crisis. In verses 5 to 6 it reads, And David's two wives were taken captives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the wife Nabal the Carmelite. And David was greatly distressed, For the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. The situation grew incredibly dire as David's men, in their grief, began to blame him and even contemplate stoning him. This would be considered a pivotal moment in David's leadership. He too was deeply distressed. But instead of succumbing to despair or retaliating against his men, David encouraged himself in the Lord. This shows a key aspect of David's character: his dependence on God in times of trouble. In 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 7 and 8, it reads, "And David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, I pray thee, bring me hither the ephod. And Abiathar brought thither the ephod to David. And David inquired at the Lord, saying, Shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, Pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. David, seeking guidance from God, calls for the ephod, a sacred garment used by the high priest to seek God's will through the Urim and the Thummim. This is a moment of faith, as David does not act impulsively or emotionally, but turns to God for direction. The Lord answers David's inquiry, pursue them, and you will succeed. In 1 Samuel 30, 9 through 17, in verses 9 through 10, and it reads, So David went, he and 600 men that were with him, and came to the brook Bezar, where those that were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 abode behind, which were so faint that they could not go over the brook Bezor. David and his 600 men set out in pursuit of the Amalekites. But as they traveled, 200 of them became too weary to continue, and are left behind at a brook called Bezor. The division highlights the exhaustion and the physical toll the journey has taken on the men. Yet David presses forward with the majority. Verses 11 through 15, David and his men find an Egyptian servant in the wilderness, abandoned by the Amalekites, who provides vital information about the whereabouts of the Amalekite camp. The Egyptian had been left behind by the Amalekites when he fell ill, and David shows mercy to him by feeding and reviving him before gaining his trust. The servant agrees to guide them to the Amalekite camp. In verses 16 and 17, And when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread abroad upon all the earth, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil that they had taken out of the land of the Philistines and out of the land of Judah. And David smote them from the twilight even unto the evening of the next day. And there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men, which rode upon camels and fled. David finds the Amalekites celebrating their victory and enjoying the spoil. Taking advantage of their complete and utter disorganization, David and his men launch a surprise attack, pursuing them from twilight until the evening of the next day, resulting in that decisive victory. In 1 Samuel chapter 30, 18 through 20, the verse reads, And David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives, and there was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither spoil, nor anything that they had taken to them. David recovered all. David's victory is complete. Not only does he recover all the people taken by the Amalekites, his wives, the men's families, but he also recovers all the spoils. This restoration emphasizes the goodness and faithfulness of God, who answers David's prayer and gives him success. In 1 Samuel, verses 21 through 25, David returns to the 200 men who were too exhausted to continue the pursuit. Some of the men suggest that these men should not receive any share of the spoils, but David insists that all share equally. His decision reflects his understanding of God's justice and generosity. He makes a rule that everyone, regardless of their participation in battle, should share in the rewards. In verses 26 through 31, David at that time sends portions of the spoils to the elders of Judah, reinforcing his growing influence and care for the tribes of Israel. This act of generosity helps solidify his leadership and further unites the people around him. Despite the dire circumstances, David's reliance on God results in victory. This chapter shows that God honors those who trust in him and seek his guidance. David's ability to encourage himself in the Lord, his compassion towards his men, and his fairness in distributing the spoils demonstrates the qualities that make him a strong and just leader. It's called leadership. The Amalekites had a long history of opposition to Israel, and their actions in raiding Ziklag were an expression of ongoing rebellion against God's people. This victory can be seen as an act of justice. However, David's mercy to the Egyptian servant shows that God's justice does not exclude mercy to those who repent or who are in need. The recovery of all the spoils symbolizes the restoration of everything that was lost. For the Israelites, this victory is a reminder that even in times of despair, God can bring about total restoration. David's conquest of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 30 is not only a military victory, but a demonstration of God's provision, justice, and faithfulness. It also highlights David's growth as a leader who will grow more in the future. Growth never ends. In times of crisis, he looks to God, acts with integrity, and leads with wisdom and compassion. Now we're going to move into the civil war between David and Ishbosheth. This war between the two of them is a significant event in the transition of leadership in Israel, making the internal conflict after the death of Saul. This period is documented and well written because it is the Bible, it is the Word of God, in 2 Samuel 2 through 4. It reflects the struggle for the throne between David, who has been appointed and anointed by God to be king, and Ishbosheth, Saul's surviving son, who is set up as king of Israel by Abner, Saul's general, would be no more. In 2 Samuel 1, it briefly talks about the death of Saul. Before the civil war begins, I think we should briefly revisit the death of Saul. Saul, being the first king of Israel, dies in battle at Mount Gilboa. His death, along with the deaths of his sons, including Jonathan, David's close friend we talked about earlier, leaves a power vacuum in Israel. While David mourns Saul's death, his path to the throne is not immediate, and the country is divided. In 2 Samuel chapter 2, we see the anointing as king of Judah. 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 1. And it came to pass after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said unto him, Go up. And David said, Whither shall I go up? And he said, Unto Hebron. After Saul's death, David seeks the Lord's guidance on where he should go. God directs him to Hebron, a significant city in Judah at that time, where he is anointed king over the tribe of Judah. This marks the first step in David's rise to kingship. But again, the nation is still divided. Let's briefly talk about Ishbosheth's kingship. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 2. Verses 8 and 9 reads, But Abner the son of Ner, captain of Saul's host, took Ishbosheth the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead, and over the Asherites, and over Jezreel, and over Ephraim, and over Benjamin, and over all Israel. While David is anointed king in Judah, Abner, Saul's military commander, installs Ishbosheth, the surviving son of Saul, as king over the rest of Israel. Ishbosheth's reign is largely symbolic, as he actually does not have the military or even the political strength that his father did. And his power is more dependent on Abner than anything else. And this, of course, sets the stage for a power struggle between David and Ishbosheth. The Battle of Gibeon, or Battle at Gibeon, I should say, in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 through 17, 12 and 13 reads, And Abner the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon, and Joab the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David, went out to meet them by the pool of Gibeon. And they sat down, the one on the one side of the pool, and the other on that side of the pool. A conflict breaks out between the forces of David, led by Joab, David's nephew, and those of Ishbosheth, led by Abner. The battle takes place at Gibeon. Before the battle, a rather strange encounter occurs, in which 12 warriors from each side engage in a one-on-one fight. But the skirmish quickly escalates into full-scale battle. In 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 17, it reads, And there was a very sore battle that day, and Abner was beaten, and the men of Israel before the servants of David. David's forces prevail in this initial confrontation. The battle is marked by significant losses on Abner's side, and Abner is forced to retreat. This victory strengthens David's position, but the war is far from over. Next, we talk about the growing rivalry between Abner and Joab in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 18 through 32. In 18 and 19, it reads, And there were 3 sons of Zeruiah there, Joab, and Abishai, and Asahel. And Asahel was as light of foot as a wild roe. Roe just means deer, by the way. And Asahel pursued after Abner, and in going he turned not to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. The battle continues as Abner and Joab, David's commander, engage in a personal rivalry. Asahel, Joab's brother, tries to pursue Abner, but in the process he is killed by Abner. This marks a turning point in the conflict, as Joab, deeply enraged with utter angerness by his brother's death, seeks revenge. However, Abner urges Joab to end the pursuit. But Joab does not relent until the battle is called off. In 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 26 and 27, then Abner called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever? Knowest thou not that it will be bitterness in the latter end? How long shall it be then, ere thou bid the people return from following their brethren?" And Joab said, "As God liveth, unless thou hadst spoken, surely then in the morning the people had gone up every one from following his brother." Abner and Joab reached an uneasy truce, agreeing to stop the fighting for the time being. How long will that last? The killing of Asahel and the continued war is what we have. 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Verse 1 reads, "Now there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker." This verse summarizes the nature of the conflict, the war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And it's long, and it's grueling. But David's forces grow stronger over time, while Ishbosheth's side, despite Abner's leadership, becomes weaker. This war, though not always marked by open battles, is also one of political maneuvering and shifting alliances, as they always are. And then we come to 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 6 through 21. Defection of Abner. In 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 6 and 7, "And it came to pass, while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner made himself strong for the house of Saul. And Saul had a concubine, whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah." Or is it Aiah? "And Ishbosheth said to Abner, Wherefore hast thou gone in unto my father's concubine?" A pivotal moment occurs when Abner, after helping Ishbosheth maintain control, defects to David's side. Oh boy. This is sparked by a dispute with Ishbosheth over a matter of personal offense. When Ishbosheth accuses Abner of taking Saul's concubine, Rizpah, as his own, Abner, insulted by the accusation, decides to join David. He sends a message to David offering to help him unite all of Israel under his rule in exchange for peace and a promise of safety. 2 Samuel 3, verse 18 reads, "Now then do it. For the Lord hath spoken of David, saying, By the hand of my servant David I will save my people Israel out of the hand of the Philistines and out of the hand of all their enemies." Abner recognizes that God has chosen David to be king over all Israel, and he seeks to bring this prophecy to fulfillment by bringing Israel under David's rule. What about the murder of Abner? In 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 22 through 30, despite Abner's defection to David, Joab, David's commander, holds a deep personal grudge against Abner for killing his brother Asahel. Joab lures Abner into a trap and kills him in cold blood. This act of vengeance sets back David's efforts to unite the kingdom. While David publicly mourns Abner's death and condemns Joab's actions, the killing reveals the deep internal divisions that still exist. In 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 29, it reads, "Let it rest on the head of Joab, and on all his father's house, and let there not fail from the house of Joab one that hath an issue, or that is a leper, or that leaneth that on a staff, or that faileth on the sword, or that lacketh bread." David pronounces a curse upon Joab's house or his role in the murder, although Joab remains a powerful figure within David's administration. The decline of Ishbosheth in 2 Samuel chapter 4, in verses 5 and 7, it reads, Ishbosheth's reign crumbles further when two of his captains, Abana and Rechab, assassinate him in his own house. Believing they are acting to bring about David's reign, they present Ishbosheth's head to David. But David condemns their actions, punishes them, and has them executed. In 2 Samuel 4:12, it reads, And David commands his young men, and they slew them, and cut off their hands and their feet, and hanged them up over the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the sepulchre of Abner in Hebron. David's response to Ishbosheth's assassination demonstrates his desire for justice and his refusal to seize the throne under treachery, or through, or involved in treachery. David's actions reflect his righteousness as a leader, and his judgment upon the assassins, well, that just further solidifies his moral and political claim to the throne. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, 1 through 5, we look at the end of the civil war. After Ishbosheth's death, the rest of Israel eventually recognizes David as their rightful king. This marks the end of the civil war, and David is anointed king over all of Israel at Hebron. He reigns for 40 years, 7 years and 6 months over Judah, and 33 years over all of Israel. The house of Saul and the house of David were in conflict. But ultimately, God's will prevails, and David is established as king over the United Kingdom of Israel. Despite the civil war and the political intrigue that we so much enjoy, God's plan for David's kingship unfolds according to his timing. David's rise to power is ordained, and he does not seize the throne by violence or manipulation, but waits for God's will to be fulfilled. Abner's defection to David's side is a turning point in the war. But even he, a once loyal servant of Saul, seeks to consolidate power for even himself. The murder of Abner and the assassination of Ishbosheth reveal the incredible corruption and influence of power and personal ambition. We see it still today. David's leadership is marked by both mercy and justice. He refuses to allow his rise to power to be tainted by bloodshed or treachery, offering a rather contrast approach to the more unscrupulous actions of others. His moral integrity, even in the face of personal loss and challenge, sets him apart as a leader chosen by God. Although the Civil War was costly, both in terms of lives lost, clearly, and the extended instability in Israel, it underscores the consequence and the consequences of division, but also the hope that unity under God brings peace and strength to the nation. The Civil War with Ishbosheth chronicles a critical and turbulent time in the history of Israel. While David emerges victorious, his leadership is marked by moral decisions that demonstrate his reliance on God, his justice, and his commitment to peace. the war eventually leads to that unification of Israel under David, setting the stage for his reign as a man after God's own heart. Well, I appreciate you taking your time this evening and listening to this little study. I'm grateful and thankful as always, and I won't go on and on for once. With that, I say good night and God bless.